Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for a conversation with author Josh Rogin, and glad to be joined by my colleague, former Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers, my bipartisan partner in leadership at the Center on all of our national security issues. Josh has written a very important book that we're going to get into and talk a little bit about this morning. It's called Chaos Under Heaven, Trump, Xi, and the Battle for the 21st Century. I want to start just by saying, Josh, your work is extremely relevant to the hottest topic in national security conversations today. It is extremely relevant to the work that CSPC has been undertaking for the past couple of years under Great Powers Competition umbrella, looking at U.S. competition, specifically at geotechnology and how the United States is positioned to compete with China in the development of advanced technologies, the kinds of technologies that are going to determine our national security future, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and others, including 5G and related communications technologies that really are going to underpin the way Americans live their lives. There is very much a technological component to this competition, but there's also a narrative component to this challenge. The narrative competition between democratic countries and an authoritarian system, which is making a run to compete for which one is going to be the dominant system in the future and define international relationships. A competition that I think there were periods of time that we thought we'd won that competition, and now it's resurgent. And it's vital that we win that because there's a lot built on in terms of our ability to leverage relationships with other countries and be a predominant player in world markets. Obviously, a big challenge. We trade with China. There's a lot built into our economic system where there's some codependency. But China being very much an adversary in many ways, it's important for us to clearly delineate where we can compete and where we can cooperate and how we separate those things. So thank you for doing the work on the book. I do want to just highlight before turning the floor over to Mike Rogers for a moment. CSPC's Joshua Huminski has written a good review of the book, and I'm going to post that in the chat box for everyone. I hope everybody will take a look at that. I will paraphrase a comment Joshua made about the book was essentially that if you're going to read one book on U.S.-China right now and you're someone in the policy community, this would be the one to read. So that's a pretty strong, I think, endorsement of the importance of the topic and the substantive nature of your work, Josh. Let me ask Mike Rogers to provide some more thoughts on why this topic is important. And then, Josh, we'll let you have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the book before we open it up to audience questions. So if you're watching with us and you'd like to pose a question, we'll put it to Josh. Please use the Q&A box whenever you feel moved, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let me go ahead and turn over to Chairman Mike Rogers, who knows this issue better than anybody. Mike?
Thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it. And Josh, great work on the book. And by the way, he was one of those reporters when I was in Congress and chairman who was dogged, but always fair and a little bit tough sometimes. But I appreciated him as in the true spirit of journalism. So, Josh, thanks for that, and thanks for spending some time on a topic that I'm delighted now is becoming a kitchen table discussion around the country, because for many years we just weren't talking about it. We weren't engaged in what serious challenges the rise of a communist China whole of government approach to dominating sectors of the economy was. And we just quite couldn't get there. And policymakers were a bit adrift. If you were free trade, you thought, well, I can't even talk about it. If you were anti-trade, you didn't talk about it in the terms of a national security threat. You talked about it in some other terms. Well, now that's all starting to mesh together, I think, with the country coming together and understanding, wow, this is a bigger risk to our liberty and freedom than maybe we realized along the way. And so as someone who's been at this from a technological intelligence side for many years now, I'm delighted to see this, and I'm delighted that you join us today. And so I don't want to take any more time. I want to hear from you, and we want to get some questions in. So thanks again, Josh. Thanks for your work in journalism, and it still is journalism. We appreciate that very, very much. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Glenn and Congressman Rogers, and thanks to your organization for all the work that they do on helping to explain these complicated national security issues to a public audience. And, basically what happened for me was that, I spent 4 years covering the U.S.-China relationship. Well, I spent 17 years covering the U.S.-China relationship, the last 5 years at the Washington Post. And it seemed to me that over those 4 years of the Trump presidency, the change in U.S. foreign policy, especially regarding the China challenge, was so significant and so fundamental that it required a deeper dive, a deeper look. So I went back and I did an additional 300 or so interviews with Trump administration officials, Congress people, staffers, intelligence people, think tankers, scientists, academics, dissidents, human rights activists, anyone I could think of, anyone who had a front row seat or even a second or third row seat to the shift, the monumental shift that has occurred. And this shift, of course, took place not only inside the administration, but around Washington, and not only in Washington, but around the country, and not only around the country, but all over the world. And, it struck me as I was doing all of this reporting that, the first draft of history on the U.S.-China relationship during the Trump presidency was written at a time of great upheaval in our society and in our politics. And the second draft, which I guess is what I tried to do with this book, tried to unpack a lot of that and tried to get beneath the surface to not only correct some of the stories that have been misreported, but also to examine fundamental questions of governance and how the China challenge was interacting with our politics and how that was impacting our society. And, just a couple of quick thoughts off the top, and I'd love to take as many questions as the audience has. What I found was, there are basically two narratives about Donald Trump and his handling of the U.S.-China relationship during his presidency. The first, most popular with the media, is that he was just a neophyte president who bumbled his way through the most important bilateral relationship at a crucial juncture. According to a lot of the coverage that you may have seen, Trump was just flailing between tough but ineffective trade wars, a love affair with China's dictator for life, and a general disregard for traditional American values like democracy, freedom, and human rights. According to this narrative, he made important decisions on a whim based on the last person he talked to, and set his factions against each other in like an Oval Office turned policy coliseum, where he lorded over the battles, picking winners based on his instincts. The second narrative, which is told mostly by those closest to the president, actually, excuse me, is that Trump actually has a very firm view on China, and that he had this outlook for many, many years, and he brought it into his presidency, and it stayed consistent throughout. And according to this narrative, Trump set his advisors against each other, not because he wanted them, not because he didn't know what he wanted, because he wanted them to serve him ideas that fit his vision. And if you look at the chaos and the conflicting statements that the Trump administration officials often put out about China, according to this narrative, they reflected the conflicts and confusion amongst his staffers, not amongst Trump himself. So in other words, these two perspectives, these two narratives are not mutually exclusive. And there are elements of truth in both, as well as sort of myths and fabrications that future historians will have to separate from hard facts. It's true, I found, that Trump prioritized his trade deal above national security concerns and cared little about human rights. It's also true that he believed that his friendship with President Xi Jinping was constructive and close, and that caused him sometimes to make concessions foolishly. And it's also true that Trump was personally committed to confronting China on the things that he cared about, such as trade, but that he constantly changed his mind about the tactics. And as we all know, the sheer chaos of the White House on all issues made a steady, much less predictable strategy more or less impossible. But the Trump the chaos that defined the Trump administration came at a time when the US-China relationship was already entering a particularly unforgiving period. When the Trump administration came to power, US-China relations were at the center of what I see as three tectonic trends. The rise of nationalism and populism due to the unequal distribution of the benefits of globalization, the rise of emerging and foundational technologies that have altered both daily life and the way that governments and companies and humans interact with each other, and the fraying of a world order that was built for an era when the United States was the only superpower and the spread of democracy everywhere seemed inevitable. But over the course of Trump's presidency, awareness inside the US government and around the country steadily grew that China's rise and Chinese government strategy play into all of these dynamics. Put simply, a China that is militarily expansionist, economically aggressive, internally repressive, and increasingly interfering in democratic societies poses enormous challenges for the United States, along with all of our friends, our partners, and our allies. And we're seeing those effects in our national security, in our investments, in Wall Street, in our schools, in Hollywood, and even in the media, and sometimes even in our elections. So the book is not a left-right book. It's not a pro-Trump book. It's not an anti-Trump book. It's not a pro-China book. It's not an anti-China book. It's meant to give my best account, the best available account of what happened in these 4 years. And my broad conclusions were that this issue, the U.S.-China relationship and how China's rise is affecting the rest of the world, is the most important thing in our foreign policy. And part of the effort of the book is to expand the discussion of this beyond the traditional China hand community. And I argue that the prerequisite for dealing with the China challenges to realize that our strategy over the last 4 years has largely failed. And by that, I mean the idea that open engagement and open integration with China would lead to China reforming economically, and that would lead to them reforming politically, and then that would solve all the other problems. The prerequisite for dealing with the China challenge is that we need to recognize that that's not working, that China is going in a different direction, that it doesn't intend to liberalize, and therefore we need a new response. We can all debate what that response has to be. All the choices will be difficult. All the trade-offs will pose national interests against each other, and the costs will be high as well as the risks. But we shouldn't fall into these traps of believing that any effort to confront China is some sort of path to a Cold War or a Thucydides trap or any other bumper sticker like that. The China challenge is not the Cold War, but it is a challenge on the scope and the scale of what we saw during the Cold War period. And that means in ways it's much more complicated because we're much more interconnected. A big theme of the book is how the China issue got politicized over those 4 years, not just because of the Trump administration, but partially because of the Trump administration. But both parties participated in abusing the China issue for their own partisan interests and agenda. And I argue that we must depoliticize this issue and that we must begin all of these crucial efforts now. I guess I'll just stop there and happy to answer whatever questions you like.
All right, let me thank you, Josh. I just want to remind our audience members, if you have a question for Josh, please submit it using the Q&A box, and we will, I'm going to ask in just a moment Dan Mahaffey to come on and put those questions to you, Josh. Let me ask you something that's on my mind, and I appreciate you addressing the issue of political polarization around the topic. Obviously, President Trump was associated with polarization on a number of issues, fairly or not. And if you're talking about describing President Trump's approach on tariffs or other individual aspects of China policy, it tended itself into a polarized debate. However, I think we also observed over the last several years, as Mike Rogers alluded to, a broad kind of bipartisan consensus developing around the nature of the problem. Whether we agree or disagree on the individual response, the nature of the challenge is becoming very much front burner for both parties. And I think that's a positive development in the sense of our national willingness to take this on in a constructive way. I wanted to just ask you a kind of a separate question, though. I'm just noting that in addition to being a columnist for the Washington Post and a political analyst for CNN, and having done foreign policy and national security related writing for a number of other outlets, including Japan's Asahi Shimbun newspaper. You are a graduate of George Washington University and also studied at Sophia University in Tokyo. Both of those universities are schools that have relationships with CSPC through our Presidential Fellows Program. And I wanted to ask you if you might comment on one of the aspects that we're studying very carefully at the center is our leveraging our relationship with allies in terms of this competition. I thought it was very notable that President Trump's first foreign visitor was Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Now we understand that President Biden will also receive Prime Minister Suga of Japan in a similarly predominant position in terms of the order of foreign leaders visiting the U.S. There is a reason for this. And I'm wondering if you might comment on the importance of U.S.-Japan relationship vis-a-vis China from your observations.
Sure. Let me answer your second question first on alliance relationships. In my conversations, especially this week with top Biden administration officials, it's clear that they're engaging in an alliance first Asia strategy. They're keeping the Chinese leadership at arm's length. All of the initial outreach was to regional allies. All of the first visits were to regional allies. Prime Minister Suga will be the first one to visit the White House. You saw the Quad meeting. It's very public. It's very clear that the message is that the United States under the Biden administration will shore up its alliances and then try to approach China from a unified position of strength. And that seems to be going okay as far as it goes. But at some point, the US and China have to sit down and actually try to work on their own issues together. And what the message that I'm hearing from Biden administration officials heading into the Alaska meeting tomorrow is that the Chinese side will try to portray this meeting as a return to normalcy and that crazy Trump era is over and now we can just get back to mutual respect and win-win cooperation. But the Biden team will attempt to make sure that narrative is not the one that's accepted, because what they're putting out is that no, we're not back to normal, and 2021 is not 2016, and we need to see real indications that the Chinese government is willing to change its behavior and stem some of its worst actions before we engage in another lengthy diplomatic process with them. So I think that's what you're going to see, tomorrow. Now, when it comes to the Trump administration's relationship with alliances, well, it was a mixed picture, to be honest. And, there were a lot of people inside the administration trying to work on this, but at the very top level, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, treated regional allies very poorly in many instances. And we saw some of this in public and some of this was in private. We're talking about demanding huge payoffs for troop basing in Japan and South Korea. I've reported that President Trump wanted to reduce the troop level in South Korea significantly. He disdained regional summits. The one that he went to in Vietnam and the Philippines, he left before the plenary just because it was running late. He didn't care. And there was a determined pattern of President Trump sort of, attacking allies and adversaries at the same time. And I think that undermined a lot of people in his administration who were working very hard in the very opposite direction. So removing that kind of dynamic from the alliance relationships does its own good. The question, I think, is where, do you take this nice new Quad thing and what do you do with it? And it's nice to have a Quad meeting, but unless the meeting results in real cooperation and real progress and real operational capacity, it's really not going to move the needle. So I think that remains to be seen. I also think that the real fights about China inside the Biden administration have yet to play out. And when we'll see them play out is when different competing interests run up against each other, and when the climate change agenda and the national security agenda really come into conflict, which will happen sooner rather than later. Then we'll find out what's in this administration's head and what's in their heart. So I think that's a long way of saying that slow and steady is their process, but if they get too caught up in process, the world will go by without them. What was your first question? I totally forgot already.
Well, I was just talking about the polarization and the chance of kind of developing a broad bipartisan general consensus on the nature of the challenge.
I've seen this go up and down and up and down. There's a great story in the book about how in February, as the pandemic was setting in, I mean, it's not a great story, it's a terrible story, but it's an interesting story about how there was a China task force that staffers in Democratic and Republican offices and committees had spent a year devising 10 committees, hearings, and they had a whole plan. And the idea was to create a bipartisan place in Congress to discuss China legislation. And the night before, and I know this personally because I had the article already written and I was about to publish it, Nancy Pelosi pulled the Democrats out of this task force because she didn't want to be seen as cooperating with the Republicans on China, because for her and her office and her leadership, that was seen as absolving President Trump from his responsibility in the mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. So there was a drive towards a lot of bipartisanship. I think that the pandemic and the election really spoiled a lot of that. I think there were a lot of abuses on the Trump side too. And when he started to use racist terms about the virus on the campaign trail, I think that tragically politicized the issue more, but also it seems led to a rise in instances of hate and violence against Asian Americans, or at least the statistics show that those numbers are way up. And that's horrible. And that actually is not only terrible for those communities who are not responsible for the actions of the Chinese government, but it's exactly the wrong way to deal with the China challenge, because that's what the Chinese Communist Party accuses us of, is politicizing the issue and making it a racial issue when it shouldn't be and it must not be. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. I think now we have a reset of sorts in the U.S. Congress and in the administration. I think there are some rumblings of new bipartisan legislation on China. I don't think it's going great right now, but there's an opportunity now with Trump gone for Republicans and Democrats to come together and to show that they can put their partisan differences aside on this issue. I don't know if it's going to work or not.
Well, nobody knows for sure if it's going to work. There's constant pressures to polarize almost every issue, not just in Washington, but across the country. That's one of the reasons why Mike Rogers and I work as a bipartisan team, two former members from opposite sides of the aisle, to try to signal very strongly that there is room for cooperation between people with different party labels. And we have started to track legislation for this cycle that's got a lot of bipartisan sponsorship. So there's a good news part of the story. And as you suggested, it's always a challenge. It's always an uphill battle to keep the train on the rails. But that's very much part of our mission. I'm going to
couple of other very quick points.
Yeah.
First of all, the polls show very clearly that Democrats and Republicans voters want a more aggressive, more assertive, more competitive China policy. So I think both parties are responding to that. And I think a lot of the overlap in the parties is on human rights. And I think when you've seen bills that promote human rights in Tibet for the Uyghurs, to protect Taiwan, to criticize the crackdown in Hong Kong, I think those are the low-hanging fruit. That's where Democrats and Republicans can all sort of stand together, because that's a human issue, not a left-right issue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask Dan Mahaffey too. We've got several questions already coming in from the audience. I'm going to ask Dan to come field some of those. And while he's getting set up, let me just do a quick plug for the latest report we issued this month on our take on the geotechnology challenge, including early Biden administration moves and some congressional response. I'm going to drop that in the chat box for folks to take a look at on their own. Dan, let me go ahead and turn over to you. We got plenty of questions, so let's go ahead and try to get as many to Josh as we can. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Glenn. And thanks, Josh. You spoke briefly about the Indo-Pacific allies earlier, but we have a question here too about the European allies, and that the Trump administration, as we know, had done some outreach. There was State Department lower level things focused on 5G technology, those areas. But at the same time, you see Europe too going ahead with the trade deal with China. How do you see, how did the administration look at Europe in relationships with China and Asia, as well as perhaps the contrast we're seeing, and perhaps too how much the Biden administration can expect to get out of Europe, even with a different tenor?
Right. Well, it's no secret that the Trump administration's relationship with our EU allies, especially the EU as an organization, was the relationships were terrible. Okay, and the President Trump launch trade wars against our allies and our adversaries at the same time. And that undermined the effectiveness of both and our leverage in both. And, over the years, his personal behavior in meetings with European officials exacerbated his unpopularity in Europe. And because those countries are democracies that actually pushed their leaders to work less with the United States than they otherwise might have. So that's a huge missed opportunity. Now, at the same time, you had a lot of officials below the president working very hard to mend those fences. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. What really changed was the pandemic. And, once the people in Europe started to realize that the Chinese Communist Party was using their first mover advantage and their advantage in terms of supplies and knowledge related to the spreading outbreak, not to just help countries in their time of need, but to, pressure them or punish them or blackmail them into shutting up about the Chinese government's handling of the pandemic or whatever it is they wanted them to shut up about. And the punishment started going around. All of these democracies realized that they had a bigger problem here. And you saw countries actually change their policies quite stunningly. The most obvious example is when the UK decided to reverse itself and ban Huawei from some of its networks. That was a recognition that the Chinese government strategy was no longer some faraway issue that didn't affect Europeans, but at the same time, they didn't do it until the people of the UK called on them to do that, because all of a sudden the pandemic had hit them literally where they live. Now, at that same time, there were also some good things going on in the administration. You had increased efforts to promote things like clean networks and clean systems, and you had more vehicles to compete with China on the development and investment front. But a lot of these efforts came, in my opinion, too little and too late. And the economic draw of China will always put countries, especially European countries, to a difficult test, whether or not to stand up for their values and I would say their interests, or to, get the money that comes with compromising and comes with doing deals with the Chinese Communist Party, where you sacrifice some of your economic independence and some of your economic integrity. And I don't, I get it. These are tough decisions for especially Central and Eastern European countries to make. But I think two things. One is that, Europe was never going to be the lead on the China challenge. Okay. It's a largely, it's not a monolith on China. And if America leads, there's a chance at least that Europe will follow. But I also think that America's leadership, first of all, has to come with real alternatives. We can't just go to our European allies with sticks. We also have to have carrots. And as I like to say, if push comes to shove, you can always hit people with carrots.
One of the things you mentioned in your response was that, President Trump so often left the damage control, running the trains on time, unruffling feathers to lower level officials. And a question from Joshua, who's reviewed your book, asks, a little bit more about those figures, the bingo club, the officials. If you could tell us more about them and how they worked to provide some coherence to the agenda or keep that effort coordinated in ways.
Right. I mean, what the book traces is sort of, a top level political environment that was largely controlled by President Trump's mood and his tolerance and his appetite for doing things on China based on where the trade deal negotiations were at any given point, based on his personal interactions with Xi Jinping, and based on his other priorities at the time. And that environment that sort of shifted, unpredictably back and forth over the course of 4 years. And what all the people underneath the president were trying to do is they were trying to track that as best they could, and then, push forward their agenda and often, their battles against other factions inside the Trump administration, with an eye towards the politics and, taking their opportunities where they could. In other words, when the mood in the White House was that cooperation with China was not going well, then a lot of other measures would come off of the shelf, like sanctions on Uyghurs, sanctions on Huawei, prosecutions of people who had violated research agreements. All of these initiatives were sort of ramped up or ramped down based on what the political appetite was at the White House over time. Now, 2 levels below that, there were a lot of people working on this issue of Chinese influence operations in the United States. And this is a very difficult issue to talk about because it's designed to be a very difficult issue to talk about. These are actions by the party, usually through proxies. Some of those proxies are Chinese, some of them are Hong Kong billionaires, some of them are American billionaires, some of them are American millionaires. And what they do is they try to use overt means that conceal a covert purpose, which is to interfere in our institutions and to do so without stating as much. And that's the nature of influence operations. And the way that the Chinese Communist Party does it is quite different from the way that the Russians did it, in the sense that they do it over time and they do it with a lot of money, and they co-opt American elites. And as all of the trade negotiations were going on, this wasn't a conversation that could really happen in public as far as U.S. officials were concerned. So they often had it in private, and a lot of those private interactions are detailed in the book. So you should go out and buy it. It's pretty interesting. Eventually, once the trade deal was signed and then the pandemic hit, a lot of those concerns went away because there wasn't much of a U.S.-China relationship to save. And the officials who were left at the end of the administration were largely in a consensus, with a couple of exceptions, that we needed to move forward with a lot of these tough on China approaches. And there was an effort to sort of move the ball forward as much as possible before Trump lost, in case he lost, and he did lose. And so a lot of things came off the shelf. But a lot of the work that you saw in 2020 was actually done in 2017 and 2018. It was just done in secret. Now, I'll just give you one really good example. A lot of people look at the trade deal and they say, oh, well, that wasn't much of a trade deal. And that wasn't, who cares about $50 billion worth of soybeans if, we just spent $2 trillion on COVID relief, But for the people inside the system, they didn't see it that way. Many of them saw the trade deal as not about soybeans, but as about the tariffs. And by that, I mean, most of the tariffs remained. And, when Congressman Rogers was talking about, technology and decoupling, if you think of what we have, is we have a sort of a semi-permanent tariff regime against most of China's high technology industries. And that creates an ongoing pressure, and some would say an ongoing cost on their economy, because these companies, of course, are involved in broad intellectual property theft and broad transfer of knowledge from American companies and the American economy. And, the trade deal didn't stop any of that. The Chinese didn't actually honor their promises to cease those activities. So what the tariffs do is they inflict ongoing costs for those behaviors. And in a sense, they also push for a limited decoupling, whether you're for that or not.
How did that, though, the mixture of those political interests, the U-turn at times on ZTE, or focusing specifically on agriculture, given the political and base matters weighing in there, how did those debates work? And did it, again, ultimately come down to President Trump wanting to raise or lower the thermostat?
Yes. I mean, what many people will say, I think wrongly, is that the Trump administration didn't have a China strategy. And what I say in the book is that actually there were several strategies, and Trump kind of wandered between them with varying levels of intentionality or awareness. And, what I document as best I could was that, actually there were several factions. And these factions formed assorted alliances based on overlapping interests. And these alliances changed over time because there was so much turnover. So on something like trade and technology, you would have, an anti sort of trade, more nationalist faction aligning itself with national security faction because they both had an interest in addressing the problem of China's technological rise. On the other side, you had Wall Street billionaires and sort of the Treasury Department and the USTR, pushing more for a deal that was beneficial to opening Chinese markets and actually integrating our economies more. So these are two totally opposing interests. And over the course of the story, they win out or lose out over time, and often it's Trump making the call. But that's why it's chaos. That's why no one could see what was going to happen the next day, is because the factions were fighting over the politics above them, but also trying to manipulate the bureaucracy below them. And these were two ongoing fights inside of our government. And the politics represented sort of the aperture, but in the end, what was going on inside of our government and what was going on inside of all these agencies also had a huge effect. So it's just too simplistic to say that there's no strategy, but it's too simplistic to say that there was a strategy. There were different ones, and some of them even Trump wasn't even aware of at times, but that's just how it played out. And, the reason it ended up where it did was because in the end, the politics all lent themselves towards being tougher on China, and the president's relationship with Xi Jinping deteriorated because the president of China lied to the US president about the COVID virus and told him that it would go away in warm weather, and told him that it would be treated by herbal medicine and that it was under control. And, once the president realized that that wasn't the case, he became very angry. And then he let loose his hardliner officials to do what they wanted. And what they wanted to do was confront China on a range of different topics.
In looking at those different topics and the interests involved, and I think, break them into three areas. And first, I want to look at the business and economic interests. How did the administration, President Trump had close relationships with many business leaders, his council of leaders. How did they look at business with China, the difficulties that American companies have, the NBA example, the hotels changing listings, all these examples we have of American business? How did the administration look at that challenge and the broader questions about the nature of capitalism and globalization and shareholder interests when it came to China and these concerns?
Sure. Three quick things. In the first 2 years of the administration, the Chinese leadership focused heavily on sending emissaries, American billionaires mostly, who they thought had really good access to the White House, and throwing them at the White House and sending them messages and trying to cut out the national security folks and the Bannons and the Navarros and the Pottingers. And that worked for a time. That's how the sort of trade negotiations, Mar-a-Lago, all that stuff kind of got started. And, these billionaires were sort of making promises on both sides and acting as informal go-betweens and back-channel negotiators, even through the rest of the trade deal. And, that was a problem for a lot of the national security people, because they couldn't track these conversations, because a lot of these guys were just friends with Trump. And so they had special access and could call him on his cell phone or whatever. And that was a hugely complicating factor in terms of policy making, but then after a while, the effectiveness and usefulness of those billionaires deteriorated. And especially after the deal was struck and the relationship deteriorated further, Trump didn't really have much use for those billionaires, and the Chinese government found themselves without a lot of really good interlocutors. Now, when you talk about sort of the NBA, that was a separate issue, because that was an issue of the Chinese Communist Party, on a parallel track, increasing its pressure and coercion on foreign institutions and foreign companies to toe the Communist Party line. And this is sort of an expansion of the Chinese social credit system, which punishes people not based on their adherence to the law, but on their adherence to the party's line, to the party's agenda. And, of course, Chinese people are already subjected to this, but for American companies, it was something new. And, I argue in the book that the Trump administration, didn't do enough to help these companies when they got in the soup, and they didn't really know they were in the soup until it was too late. And by the time the NBA realized that they could be punished and lose $400 million over one tweet, there was no amount of groveling that they could do to get out from under. And the reaction from Washington was largely to wag fingers at them. But I think the NBA was actually a victim of this Chinese Communist Party social credit coercion scheme. And, there ought to be some way for the government to help American companies not get pressured to squash the free speech of their companies. And then, the Wall Street piece is super interesting. There's a whole chapter on this in the book, because, as these different institutions, the NBA and college campuses and Silicon Valley firms and eventually Wall Street firms started to realize that the national security implications of China's rise also impacted them, they reacted in really different ways. And the reaction in Wall Street was, you national security people, you better, stay out of our business. And, we're trying to make money here, and, we need access to this market. And the national security community was very emphatic to note, if the way that you're making money is by investing hundreds of millions of Americans' hard-earned retirement funds into Chinese companies that are committing atrocities or building the military that's pointed against us, well, then that's not okay. And we have to have a conversation about that. And that clash lasted about a year until the Trump administration, again, for a lot of reasons we already talked about, decided to side with the national security community and take steps to curb Americans investing in Chinese companies that can't be audited, that are, may be susceptible to Chinese Communist Party instructions and, edicts that put not only Americans' information at risk, but also put their futures at risk. In other words, how can you sanction a company like Hikvision and then Wall Street, pumps $100 billion into the company? It totally undermines the sanctions. That doesn't make any sense. It's totally crazy. And so at some point, Wall Street and the administration had to have a conversation about, do we want to fund these companies that are committing atrocities and that are building the military pointed at us? And, that conversation is actually still ongoing. But finally, I think, a lot of Wall Street firms and indexes are coming to the realization that, putting Americans' money into Chinese companies that are committing atrocities is not a good idea. It's not something we should be doing.
Moving on from the economic to the diplomatic, and we spoke already on alliances, but there's a question about the WHO and the pandemic response, but I think it also opens up to other international institutions, standards bodies, organizations like that. How did that fit into the competition and the perhaps the differing visions of the utility of international cooperation between the Oval Office and those elsewhere in the administration?
Right. Well, again, this is sort of one of those good news, bad news stories because, I documented in the book how the Trump administration, for the first time, really started to look at the whole host of international organizations, especially UN organizations, that the Chinese government has slowly but surely amassed control over, either directly or indirectly, either through putting Chinese officials in charge of them, or by corrupting them, or by corrupting the people in charge of them. And one of the things that shocked me was, when the Trump administration came in, they found that 26 UN organizations had signed memorandums of understanding with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and 26. So that's 26 UN organizations supporting China's economic strategy, which, our government position was that, this strategy was producing malign outcomes in a number of different ways. And we just weren't aware of that, and the problem, of course, and the same thing with the Uyghurs and a lot of other issues with China's behavior around the world, there was just a lack of understanding about how UN organizations were sometimes complicit in these activities, and sometimes co-opted, and sometimes just silent. At the same time, the Trump administration was expressing disdain towards these same multilateral organizations. And so it reduced their ability to affect change, because if you were in one of these multilateral organizations and the Trump administration was like, we don't like your organization, by the way, you got to do what we say, you would probably say, go to hell, which is what a lot of them did. So there was a contradiction there that I think could be corrected, actually, if we engage these organizations and then confront the issue of malign Chinese influence, in an honest and forthright way, without, bashing them on the head with our own agenda. At the same time, I'm not saying that's going to be easy. So, some of the worst offenses were, the World Bank and, what was it? When you get to the WHO, it wasn't, in my opinion, so much that the WHO was intentionally trying to do anything to cover up on behalf of China. Is that they were in this position that a lot of organizations which are in, is that they really didn't know any better, and that they were, taking in the Chinese government's information and regurgitating it with their own credibility attached, and it was all wrong and it was all garbage, and that led to a lot of misinformation being spread that we're still trying to untangle today. And that's more incompetence than malicious on the part of the WHO, but the effect is the same. Is that it allowed the Chinese government to put a bunch of misinformation about the pandemic and continue to through our system that has real harm and real suffering for real people all over the world. And when you look at this investigation, and it's not just me saying this, the Biden administration has expressed deep concerns about the WHO investigation because they're not able to get the data, and because members of the investigation have clear conflicts of interest. And so, it just goes to show you that, how far a lot of these international organizations have fallen in their ability to deal with the Chinese government, in an honest and forthright and even confrontational way. And that basically means that, if we want these investigations to go forward in a credible way, we're probably going to have to push for some other organization, some other body to do it. And more broadly, we have to go through all of these organizations, not to get rid of China or to get rid of the Chinese government, but just to make sure that they exist in a space of integrity and in a space of protection from Chinese malign influence. And I think the best way, personally, that we can do that is by engaging them more.
Moving now to questions we have on the national security, intelligence, that area and arena. What do you say to those who critique the administration's China response as a way to downplay or distract from Russia in great power competition, given concerns about equal or weighted differently about Moscow and Beijing?
It's a truism that both the Russia U.S.-Russia relationship and the U.S.-China relationship have become highly politicized in the Trump administration for totally different reasons, right? They're totally different stories, but they both fallen victim to our politics. And it's true that there were some inside the Trump administration who are advocating for, what they call a reverse Nixon. Ben used to call it a reverse Nixon. We're going to ally with Russia against China because that's in our interest. Of course, I never thought that made any sense, and I don't think it makes any sense now because, in essence, the Chinese and the Russians feel that their interests are more closely aligned with each other than either of them are aligned with us. Plus, Russia is committing all of these horrible aggressions against us in public and private. So it doesn't seem like that reverse Nixon was ever really going to be possible. But that was the idea, especially amongst, I would say, including Mike Flynn and some others, and maybe in Trump's mind as well, from what we saw. But I think we can sort of just easily fall into some sort of a crackerjack false analysis if we try to, put the Russia challenge and the China challenge together and say, oh, well, we can come to some easy conclusion about how these two things interact. This is why I sort of always push back against these people who are like, oh, well, it's a Thucydides trap or, it's a Cold War, because I think these are all like simplistic constructions that we need to just snap out of that, and we need to sort of take our analysis to one more level of nuance where we can say, okay, the Russia challenge is significant and will be here for a while, and it presents itself in a number of ways. And the China challenge is also huge and complex, and we have to deal with that. We can't afford to deal with one and not the other, and we can't afford to conflate them, and we can't afford to conflate the China challenge with the Soviet Cold War. It seems to me that the China challenge should be the bigger priority just because of the scope and the scale of the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party in our public life and its threat to our security and our prosperity and to our freedom and to our public health. And because of the genocide and because of the crackdowns and because of the threats to Taiwan and because of the threats to our allies, and because it's the second biggest economy and will soon be the first biggest economy. And so I think objectively, that, in my opinion, that should be the number one challenge, foreign policy challenge that we deal with. But I don't know if you're going to say that. I just don't buy that. That means we have to ignore the Russia challenge or see it any differently than what it is, which is another, albeit less, in terms of scope and scale, but another very huge challenge for our country.
In terms of the military balance technology, we see these stories. Our own senior fellow James Kidfield reported on war games that again and again show the U.S. losing. But the President Trump, repeatedly trumpeted the expanded military spending, the creation of Space Force. All of these are, trends that we see in terms of the military. But what were some of those decisions and also the strategic vision behind that? And a problem I think that's going to affect no matter what party or president, ultimately the budgetary costs and matching. When you look at China laying 30 hulls a year or things like that, where does the long-term strategy and coordination come in when you see that kind of long-term challenge?
Right. It was popular during the Trump administration to say that the strategy documents didn't matter. The national defense strategy, the national security strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy that was released in January 2020. It was, conventional wisdom to say that, oh, well, Trump doesn't read them, so why should we pay attention to them? But the truth is, and I think the reporting bears this out in the book, is that they did matter because it gave instructions to different agencies about priorities and about where their attention should be focused. And, of course, it didn't always win the day But I think that the process of building all of those strategies, including their classified components, which still exist, shifted the government, not the administration, the government, in a way that fundamentally can't be undone. And I think if you see the Biden administration's interim national security strategy, you'll see a lot of continuity. Okay. Now, what you pointed out is what people on the ground point out, which is that the resources were never fully provided. And that's not just me saying that. If you just look at the testimony of people like Admiral Phil Davison, the head of PACOM, they always say, okay, well, yeah, we love these initiatives, but the funds just aren't there. And this is sort of the same old story in Washington, a focus on legacy programs run by legacy companies and legacy contractors that are very politically ingrained and industrially ingrained into our system. And if you're going to really affect this pivot that all of these administrations have been promising, it's going to require trade-offs, and some things are going to have to be actually shifted. And that means making tough choices in a world of limited resources, and largely those hard choices have not been made. And we've got a lot of bills and a lot of strategies that say that we're moving our attention to Asia, but both the U.S. Personnel on the ground and the allies on the ground, they tell me the same thing over and over again, which is that we really don't see it in terms of, and of course, you'll have people that will point out instances of increased this, and we did more of that, and we had a visit here, and we moved the ship there. And I'm not saying all those things aren't fine and significant, but more broadly, we have yet to make a fundamental decision in the way that we organize our spending, not only to shift from Middle East to Asia, but to shift from the things that we used to fight in the last war to the things we need to fight in the next war. And that's a huge investment in the new emerging and foundational technologies of the future. I don't think the China challenge is about ships. I don't think it's about missiles. I don't even think it's about nukes. It's mostly economic and technological and partially ideological. And some will say, well, we shouldn't make it ideological, but the CCP believes it's ideological. And we know this because Xi Jinping says it all the time. So if you think about the challenge in that way, you can see how even today our resources are woefully, out of line.
Looking as we, as we're looking at time here and moving towards final questions, one of the things we've talked about at CSPC is you don't try to out China. And I have another good comment here from Commissioner Malloy in our Q&A. It says, looking retrospectively at the effort we spent over the 20 years trying to change China, what effort do we need to now spend changing ourselves for this competition? Right. Looking forward, if you're to be writing the sequel to this one day, I don't know if you'll call it tensions amidst purgatory, but where is this heading, and what does that effort look like in the U.S. to adapt to this new paradigm?
Right. When I say what I read in the book, we can't out China, and I think it's a really important message. In other words, we can't have this hubristic idea that China is going to have an economic, social, political, cultural system that's the same as ours. And the China's development will be driven by the Chinese people one way or the other. And, while we all should care very much about the Chinese government's treatments of its own citizens, especially as it commits atrocities against those citizens, the more urgent priority for us actually is China's behavior outside of its own borders. And that's the thing that we have to strive for, is to establish a relationship with China, in my view, that both sides can live with, right? To avoid the conflict that neither side seeks. And that means convincing the Chinese government to change how it behaves in our countries, on our soil, and how it exerts a strategy at the expense of our security and our prosperity and our freedom and our public health. And, if they won't change, then to impose increasing costs on the Chinese Communist Party for perpetrating that strategy that's aimed against us. And I think that's what the Trump administration was trying to do. They were trying to reset, to rebalance the relationship that they felt had gone, out of whack. And, what also I say in the book is that, we can't become the thing that we're fighting, and we can't, make America inhospitable to Chinese citizens the way that China, for many of us, has become inhospitable to Americans. And we have to, we can't overreact. And, you see lots of articles these days about we shouldn't overreact. And of course we shouldn't overreact. I 100% endorse that idea. We must not overreact. And on the other hand, it's not a very useful point because it's a truism. Of course we shouldn't overreact. We can't do everything. We have to choose what are the things that we devote our limited time and attention to, but also we have to uphold our values. And that means being a welcoming country for Chinese and Chinese Americans who contribute greatly to our society, and to also uphold the things that make our democracy a more attractive model than the authoritarian model that China is putting forward. That means reforming our institutions and making democracy work for citizens, and having rule of law, and standing up for human rights in our own country and other places around the world, and having justice and pluralism and accountability, and believing and living it with the idea that the individual has these rights, and that those rights are not, that the individual is not the property of the government or the state. And if we were to really uphold all of those things, I think that that package of ideas and that package of values is much more attractive than to anyone around the world than the false choice that China puts forward, which is if you only are willing to give up your freedom, we'll give you a chance to have prosperity. It's a fake promise, right? In the end, you end up getting neither freedom or prosperity. But unless we have a real alternative that we can defend and that we can live up to, it'll be harder to make that argument.
Well, before I turn it over to back to Congressman Nye to wrap up, Josh, I want to thank you for joining us and taking the questions. The book Chaos Under Heaven, check it out. Joshua's review speaks very well of it. It's on my to-read list as a China wonk, so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I just want to add my thanks, Josh, for doing the work of the book, for sharing your thoughts on it today. Clearly, we're very much aligned in our focus on a very important topic. I think your book will help us, as you suggested, broaden the audience of interested people from the ones we could already capture in Washington who are kind of forced to grapple with this because they're already in the national security community, or in the economic policy community, out to a broader group of Americans who have heard, they understand the top lines, but haven't quite grappled with how we win this competition. And indeed, if it is a competition that we must win, how to think about it pragmatically in a way that we can get ourselves oriented around. Thank you so much for doing the work. Thank you to our participants. And Josh, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Anytime. Thank you.
All right, everybody, take care. Thanks and be well.